WZDX News presents a special simulcast event, Apollo 11 T+50. Presented with limited commercial interruption by Women for Women, Huntsville's premier OBGYN practice, Closets by Design, and Alabama Insurance Services of Decatur. Now, Apollo 11 T+50.
The history of rocketry goes back a long way. In America, Robert Goddard was working with liquid rocket engines, first test firing in 1926. In Russia, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was working on a staged vehicle, the theory behind a staged vehicle to get to orbit. In Germany and in Hungary, Hermann Oberth was someone who wrote about space travel, wrote about vehicles that would achieve that. And that book that he wrote actually came into the hands of a young Dr. Wernher von Braun. Von Braun read this book, understood that, it was something that struck him. He was passionate about it from a very early age. He knew that he needed to get into math and science pretty quick, and he needed to find like-minded people to really get out and prove this technology out. In Germany, von Braun came into the eye of the army. The German army from the Versailles Treaty, had been basically banned from certain types of technology, artillery and that sort of thing. But at the end of World War I, they hadn't foreseen the development of rockets. And that was kind of a loophole. And the Army exploited that, and they exploited this young technology to develop something that would give them some, a national strength. So flash forward, von Braun is, at school. He's at the University of Berlin working on his thesis. The Army, by this point, is basically funding his research, and as long as he's working on it, his research is classified. The German Army is very much involved in this process. They're really trying to develop this technology, and eventually they're going to move von Braun and his group to a place off the Baltic Sea, Peenemünde. Peenemünde is a place the V1 and the V2 rockets will be developed under von Braun's guidance, under the Army's influence there. It becomes operational by 1944, very late in the war from Germany's perspective, and it has a very minimal influence on the outcome of that war. It's basically too late by that point, and the rockets never were exactly what they thought they would be. But the technology was phenomenal. It was something that had never been done before. It was something that people had theorized about, but now it's becoming an engineering reality. When the war is coming to a close, and Nazism is basically being defeated, the American Army understood that there was a new weapon out there, something that they really wanted to understand more about, learn more about. They'd been experimenting with rocketry to some degree, but these were people who had done it. They were engineers who had solved the big problems. Guidance and control was something that they'd basically perfected on this scale, and the Americans wanted to have that technology, something we refer to as intellectual reparations. But the most important thing at the end of World War II was to prevent this technology, this knowledge, from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. As a way to make that happen, to get that expertise here to America, something called Operation Paperclip was basically devised by the Department of Justice to bring scientists, engineers from all over. It eventually will grow into all over the world, but at this time it's directed at getting our hands on this German knowledge. As part of that, von Braun comes up with a list of names of about 120, 118 people that he would like to bring with him to America. When it appears that Germany is going to surrender, von Braun and his team basically sneak away, and they see themselves, their best efforts at a future to continue to develop this technology is with the American government. They surrendered to the Americans to avoid being captured by the Soviets, somebody they viewed as ideologically different from them for different reasons, but somebody they believed that might not have the funding available. Von Braun's group does come to America, but there was another group of these Germans who actually did go to the Soviet Union. They actually came in to Peenemünde and tried to restore and bring that facility back operational. And eventually, a lot of those scientists and engineers from the German rocket team were actually taken to the Soviet Union, where they worked in separation from Soviet scientists and engineers who were developing at that time what would become the R-7 launch vehicle. The R-7 is important because that's going to be the vehicle, the heavy lift vehicle, that the Soviets are going to use to launch Sputnik in the family of that vehicle. Now, von Braun and his group do eventually come to America, and they come to Fort Bliss, Texas. And at Fort Bliss, there's a program to share this knowledge that the Germans brought with them about this V2 to the young American engineers in the Army. A lot of good science comes from this. Photography from space eventually comes from this. There's research and development about, what is the space environment like, because this is something at the time no one knew. And that takes place out there over the series of about 4 or 5 years, from 1946 to 1950, under von Braun's guidance and the guidance of his team out there. In 1950, something kind of important happens, the outbreak of the Korean War. The Korean War was seen as the first asymmetrical war, a place where the West would encounter the Soviet Union for the first time. And that began to be a very delicate thing. With the outbreak of war, the Army foresaw a conflict that involved atomic weapons. In Korea, that looked to be possible. What the Army needed was a strategic on some level, but more of a tactical delivery system for a nuclear payload. In 1950, in July of that year, the von Braun team comes to Huntsville, Alabama. There were a lot of things going around behind the scenes to make that happen. U.S. Senator John Sparkman, U.S. House Representative Bob Jones were working diligently behind the scenes to bring this effort to Huntsville, Alabama, and they were successful. It could have gone several different places, but eventually it was decided that this place was ready. REDSTONE Arsenal was already here. It had been used as a chemical munitions plant during the war. It had been shut down. It had fallen on hard times. Huntsville was looking for the next big investment. So in 1950, when the von Braun team arrives here in Huntsville, they began to develop what would become the REDSTONE rocket. Facilities had to be put in place, people had to be hired, and new lessons had to be learned. And that's what's going to happen over the next several years. Huntsville, from that time forward, will move from about 15,000 people to over 100,000 people in just short of a decade. So the rocket program here in Huntsville really set Huntsville on a brand new trajectory, a pace that would make it one of the most cosmopolitan centers in the country. Throughout the decade of the 1950s, the Cold War really does emerge. There's a lot going on in Europe at this time. There's a fear of war that could break out at any minute. In an attempt basically to pull back from some of that, there was an opportunity that emerged in science, and it was the International Geophysical Year. Part of that program was the attempt to launch the first satellite to orbit the Earth. The Soviets are willing to do it, the Americans are on board. Eisenhower, who's president by this time, decides that he's going to give that to the Navy, allow the Navy to put up the first American satellite as part of this process. They select the Viking rocket from the Vanguard program. Because the Viking vehicle had been chosen, that meant that the REDSTONE vehicle, that the Germans were developing here, would not be used. Well, it becomes kind of a moot point in October of 1957 when the Soviets launch Sputnik. The launch of Sputnik really was something that, from the Eisenhower administration standpoint, it wasn't that surprising. The Eisenhower administration understood that we were well ahead of the Soviets when it came to delivery systems. They knew that, but that was classified. President Eisenhower also knew something else. He had something called a U-2 spy plane, and he was running spy missions over the Soviet Union all the time, and he had this great access to information. Again, he's not shocked. And yet another reason from Eisenhower's perspective was that he wanted the Soviets to be first. He knew it would be a blow to morale and these sort of things, but what it would do was it would establish a precedent. It would allow the Soviets to be first to send a satellite around Earth orbit. And what that meant was Earth orbit would become a place of peace. If the Americans were the first to launch a satellite, let's say that we were successful with the Viking program and launched that satellite first, the Soviets could see that as a threat. But by allowing the Soviets to be first, Eisenhower made that decision, and Eisenhower, that was something he could live with. Here in Huntsville, it wasn't something people could live with. Well, Sputnik is enough of a shock that the Eisenhower administration does turn to the group here, the Army group in Huntsville, to, okay, the Navy failed, Viking Vanguard is not going to work out for us. It will eventually, but we want to go with your option, which is to launch Explorer 1, and that happens in January of that next year, 1958. All of this activity in 1957, 1958 really serves as an impetus for Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson, who's in the Senate by this time. Johnson wants to make Eisenhower look bad. So Johnson is going to portray this as negatively as he can, to show to the American public, look, we've got to move on from these elder statesmen to a new young movement, and we've got to move ahead. We're falling behind. We've got to catch up. All of this process kind of rolls into the creation of NASA. With NASA, you're going to have a lot of this new technology, rocketry, satellites, that would be strictly for the peaceful exploration of space. And NASA opens for business October of 1958. It takes 2 years, but finally, in 1960, the core group from the Army, what was at that time known as the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, is transferred to NASA officially. Dedicated in September of that year with Eisenhower's visit to Huntsville to the center to proclaim this is the creation of the George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. Now, behind the scenes in 1960, a lot of work for a particular program was already underway, and that was the Saturn program. The Saturn program was born of an Army effort for a larger delivery system. In order to do that with the materials that they had at the lowest cost that they had development-wise, they wanted to use the tools they had. And to do that, they took the REDSTONE tankage, 8 REDSTONE tanks, and clustered them, gathered them around the center of a Jupiter tank. And that became what's known as the Saturn I vehicle. Something else that happened in 1960 was the presidential election of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was from a different generation. He had World War II experience, he was a veteran, but in 1960 the American public looked like it was turning a page from Eisenhower, who had been outdated, behind the times. But Kennedy understood that space was a subject that he could bring all of his young energy to. It was new, it was technologically savvy, the people who were behind it were intelligent. It looked like the force that was going to bring on his new Camelot. Basically, Kennedy wasn't so interested in space in itself, but it was the idea of space that interested him more than anything. And from the time he's inaugurated in early 1961, Kennedy is faced immediately with a series of great challenges. Kennedy was looking for something that could turn this around. In May 1961, something happened that gave him some leverage. In April of that year, Yuri Gagarin, the Soviets, had launched into space, a human being orbiting the Earth, again, on the background of Sputnik. This was one more major catastrophe. After Gagarin's flight, Kennedy is talking to everyone involved in the space program. How can we beat them? Where can we beat them? They seem to be beating us at every step. We have to demonstrate something bold, a new challenge. But on May the 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard is launched into space. Shepard's flight gives Kennedy the momentum. And on May the 25th, 1961, he issues the challenge to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth.
With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Now, the information that Kennedy had gotten from all of the folks at NASA, from Von Braun himself, from his science advisors, told him that this was the place that we would beat the Russians. As the Saturn program is developing here in Marshall, Kennedy decides to pay Huntsville a visit, and that happens in September 1962. While he's here, Kennedy is going to tour the labs. He's going to look at some hardware that's under development, and he's actually going to see a test of the first stage of the Saturn I launch vehicle. Kennedy comes away from that test and he tells, Von Braun, I'm impressed. I see that you're taking a step to ensure that the goal that I've set is going to be accomplished. Shortly after that, Kennedy leaves and he goes to Texas to Rice University. And it's at Rice University where Kennedy basically doubles down on his goal.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And after the Rice speech, it basically is, America doing what he says, doing these things because they are hard, not because they are easy. And it wasn't easy. It was a monumental effort across America that took kind of an all-hands-on-deck approach. But it's that call to arms, basically, by John F. Kennedy that really sets things here in another gear. By 1965, 1966, federal investment in the space program is going to double, triple, quadruple, because Kennedy understood that this was so important. With the Cold War looming, America needed a victory. In Alabama at this time, there's another great movement, the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement and the Apollo program will intersect in Huntsville, Alabama like they intersect nowhere else. In January of 1962, a sit-in movement begins downtown. The African American leadership of the Civil Rights Movement here in Huntsville understood that federal funding provided a powerful amount of leverage in the process of desegregation. This was leverage to make Huntsville different, and they utilized that lever. In 1962, they protested, both in New York and the Chicago Midwest Stock Exchange, protesting, handing out flyers to investors in the stock market. Don't invest in Huntsville, it's bad for business. They're just as racist as everyone else. Well, immediately this got on the radar of the powerful leadership here in Huntsville, from the industrial community, the IBMs of the world, the Brown Engineerings of the world, the Boeings of the world. And they understood that this was problematic. And from that moment forward, the white leadership here in the city and in the industry begins a dialogue with the black community to desegregate this area. And all of that's brought on by this federal investment for the space program here. And it does turn Huntsville into basically an oasis of progressivism in the Deep South. But it doesn't really solve the major issues of day-to-day life, of inequalities on the ground. And African Americans continued to press for that. Civil rights leaders continued to press. Martin Luther King, who had come to Huntsville at one time to give a speech at Oakwood College, he actually gave a version of the I Have a Dream speech right at Oakwood College. In 1963, he gives that speech before the world. He continues to press throughout the decade for equality. All of this is wrapped around the space program. So early on, the space program has a huge impact. In 1963, after the assassination of Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson's going to take over the mission. He takes over, and basically Kennedy's martyrdom had created a situation where Apollo was now a national goal for different reasons. It was, we were going to finish Kennedy's mission in honor of him. And that became a big part of that. Here in Huntsville in 1965, static testing of the first stage of the Saturn V begins in earnest. That's something that people quickly noticed. All of this investment, all of it, it seemed, if you didn't work for NASA, maybe it was an abstract thought. We're building something for the space program. But in 1965, when those ground tests begin, people's windows are shaking. They can feel that change. They can feel their own participation in that space program. And to this day, it's kind of a nostalgia, right? That was their participation in the program. They felt that large 7.5 million pounds of thrust generated by that first stage during static test. They were able to feel that. People here who'd worked on that program, they'd seen the Saturn I testing, they'd seen smaller testing, they'd seen engine testing, but they hadn't seen something like that. And from that moment on, people began to understand this is a reality. So things are moving along at a very rapid rate. Marshall, behind the scenes, had been working on the Saturn program day and night, trying to develop this heavy lift launch vehicle. In January of 1967, during what was basically going to be called a plug-out test of the Apollo spacecraft, basically you had 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, in the capsule, unplugging, communicating back and forth with Kennedy Space Center. A fire broke out in the cap. It was a pure oxygen environment. And that fire basically consumed everything in there in a very short period of time. This tragedy sent a ripple effect across all of NASA. Were we moving too fast? Should we stop for a minute, think through this, understand what caused that problem, evaluate, test, and then move forward again? And that's what NASA does. In November 1967, the first all-up test of the Saturn V launch vehicle took place. That was Apollo 4. People gathered at the Cape, they saw that thing take off, and it was basically flawless. The Apollo 4 proved out the value of this Army system that had grown and had transferred over into NASA. And it proved out the idea that Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon and returning safely to Earth was going to happen in the decade. Well, the next test of the Saturn V didn't go so well. The launch of Apollo 6 was less than stellar. The first stage fired right off the launch pad at Kennedy and experienced what they call POGO, and it's thrust oscillation, up and down, longitudinal oscillation up and down the vehicle. Now, by the time that oscillation gets to the top, it can create damage to the structure, and it can put human lives at risk. That wasn't something that you could tolerate. People understood by this point what POGO was. They understood how it happened, and they just didn't see it happening in the Saturn V. They thought they'd fixed the problem. To solve a problem like that took people really thinking outside of the box. And that's what Saturn V was all about. If we're going to solve these problems, if we're going to get to the moon and build a Saturn V, we're really going to have to think in a new way. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Ralph Abernathy, who's been with Martin Luther King throughout this period, continues what he'd called the Poor People's Campaign. Now, the Poor People's Campaign was something that, when the Civil Rights Movement after 1964, 65, when it had turned from legal equality to economic equality again, the Poor People's Campaign, started by Martin Luther King Jr., was a way to bring attention to that. The poor suffering in the ghettos, the poor blacks and whites to some degree. Johnson initiates the war on poverty. He turns from civil rights to attacking poverty on a national scale. When King is assassinated, Ralph Abernathy really takes up that mantle of leading the Poor People's Campaign. Abernathy understood that the federal government expenditures on Apollo were very visible, that people understood that a lot of money was being spent for that. So Abernathy leads the Poor People's Campaign to Kennedy Space Center right on the eve of the Apollo 11 launch. And he's there talking about these issues and putting them before the American public. Look at us. We show up on a mule train traveling the country of poor blacks in the face of a technological marvel like the Saturn V and the Apollo program. I think really that moment in American history really illustrates what's going on in that decade.
Cape Kennedy, Florida, July 16, 1969. Michael Collins, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Commander Neil Armstrong prepare for the launch of Apollo 11.
11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The massive Saturn V accelerates the astronauts through the Earth's atmosphere and toward their objective, some 240,000 miles in the distance. 76 hours after liftoff, the Command and Service Module Columbia, along with lunar module Eagle, are in lunar orbit. Collins remains inside Columbia as Armstrong and Aldrin begin their descent aboard the lunar module. As the Eagle approaches the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin scan the horizon in search of a suitable landing zone. Avoiding boulders and craters consumes time and, more importantly, precious fuel.
1201, roger, 1201 alarm. We're go, same tide, we're go.
Aldrin calls out altitude and position as Armstrong pilots the craft.
40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust.
Mission Control anxiously monitors the critical fuel situation as the remaining flight time counts down to a matter of seconds.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
A journey that lasted 103 hours leads to the step that will forever change the course of human history.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Aldrin exits the Eagle shortly after Armstrong. He later describes the moonscape simply as magnificent desolation.
You got something? Magnificent desolation.
Around the world, millions watch the live television broadcast and hang on every movement and every word.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
The decade of the 1960s was a time of great turmoil in the United States. After all, the country was divided by racial lines, economic lines, and by the war in Vietnam. But the country, and in some ways much of the world, was united by one goal, the moonshot. One has to wonder what might have been, if not for the unifying force that was the Apollo program. For WZDX News, I'm Mike Black.
I hired into the Boeing Company in 1957. Back then it was called the Boeing Airplane Company up in Seattle, Washington. And I worked up there for a couple of years, and then lo and behold, in 1964, they transferred my organization, complete with lock, stock, and laboratories, to Huntsville, Alabama. And I told my wife, now don't worry, honey, 18 months, 2 years, we'll get back to God's country. That was in 1964, and I'm still here, and I buried her in Maple Hill Cemetery 4 years ago. They had a big test stand that they built out at Marshall, and we got involved in doing the instrumentation for that particular program, the DTV program, Dynamic Test Vehicle program. And that was my first involvement completely with the Saturn program. We were primarily concerned with the S1C stage because that was a Boeing stage. The S2 and the S4B and the instrument unit and the payload, the command module, that was the responsibility of Houston. And we didn't have a whole lot to do with that other than to make sure that everything under it was working properly so that we could go ahead and get the vehicle off the ground safely. And we were very successful in that. Every one of the final Saturn program vehicles launched perfectly. There were no miscues on any of them on the first 3 stages. There was a lot of discord going on throughout the country, but the one thing that people seemed to agree upon was that we've got to keep the space program going smoothly. We've got to do what the president asked us to do. We've got to get there before the Soviets do. And we did. We actually did it. They did exactly what the president asked us to do. So we were happy about it.